welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you're listening to a weekly podcast about books and life, not necessarily in that order. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show on iTunes, or use our RSS feed with your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter, Instagram, and SoundCloud at VMSPod, on Facebook at facebook.com/virtualmemoriesshow, on Tumblr at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube with a really complicated URL, so just go to youtube.com and search for Virtual Memories Show. Now, you can support this podcast and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/VMSPod and set up your level of support. Every week you'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my quarterly bonus podcast, Beer of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/VMSPod or paypal.me/VMSPod and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. No travel this week. I'll be back in D.C. next week for some planning sessions, so I'll be up to my Amtrak-y ways again. Meanwhile, I'm also a few weeks ahead of the podcast, which generally leads to trouble because it means I start reading things that aren't on the guest list, as it were. This past weekend, I took up Merchant of Venice after reading a Roger Greenblatt essay about it in the New Yorker a few weeks back. I had some thoughts, which I will share through the patron blog that we have here, and I'll probably publish in the year-end list of all the books I've read. That's up on our website, chimeraobscura.com/VM, etc. Also on a whim last night, and this is a weird whim to have, I took Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz off my shelf. I've never read him before, and I'm finding myself pretty compelled now. I will just say that future biographers and historians can correlate the dates of these particular episodes and figure out why I'm reading what I'm reading. Now, this week's show, to get on a brighter note, that came together in a weird hurry. Back in July, I was up in the Boston area for ReaderCon, the literary SF and fantasy festival, and we have a bunch of episodes coming from that weekend. And while I was up there, I decided to hit up Sven Birkerts to see if he was around and up for recording a podcast. We had talked about doing one for a few years, but I've been really busy, and from New Jersey, Boston is really a goddamn hassle to get to. And until recently, Sven was a director of the low-residency MFA program at Bennington College, and we'd actually met there a couple of times, but that's usually when he's really working hard, so we couldn't make the time to record then. I'd planned to go back up this last June when he was retiring from that role. He's still an instructor there, but stepping down as director. Life keeps kicking my ass in so many ways. So after ReaderCon wrapped, and I was headed into Boston for a pharmaceutical industry event for my day job, I called Sven and visited him in Arlington, Mass., and we launched into the episode you're about to hear. So that means I did not get to prep as much as I usually do for a show, but at the same time, I've enjoyed Sven's essays for like 20 years and figured we would do just fine. And of course, we ended up talking longer than anyone else I recorded with that whole weekend. So I first got keyed into Sven's work back in the 90s. I'm not joking about the 20 years plus with his stuff. He published the Gutenberg Elegies back in the mid-90s. It was a series of essays about the impact of digital technology on reading. And this was just as the internet was beginning to take off. And for me, I had one foot in the great books world. I had just finished up at St. John's College getting my master's there, but the other foot was planted pretty firmly in the cyberpunk and techno rave kind of world. So overall, I was really interested in what he had to say in terms of the technology, literature, how that's our relationship to that has changed, how they help us relate to the world outside. back then, the guy I was thinking that hypertext like Victory Garden and video like Wax, the discovery of television among the bees, was where art was going. And like everyone else, my predictions sucked. Things moved in radically different directions and have a weird sense of familiarity to them instead of the utter strangeness and uncanniness that I was pursuing in the art that I consumed and thought I was going to make myself. Anyway, last year, Sven published a new collection called Changing the Subject, Art and Attention in the Internet Age. And it's I want to say, more mature book, both in terms of Sven having 20 more years to ruminate on things, but also now that we've seen some of the shakeout in terms of how reading has changed in the e-world and how it's continuing to change and how our relationship to images and the outside world differ from what they were 20 years ago. Sven's work is always immensely thoughtful, and Changing the Subject left me ruminating on the role of technology in my life in a lot of ways. I mean, you can hearken back to Plato's Phaedrus dialogue for conversation about how new technology screws with people's internal abilities and their relation to the world. Back there, they're talking about how the myth of how writing reduces your need and ability to remember stuff because you can externalize things. And of course, nowadays technology is both more helpful and more pernicious. And I guess it's a question of how you make the best of it. That is, it's a weird thing, but when we talk about machine intelligence, do machines really get smarter and more intuitive, or do we sort of debase the human mind until it's barely more than a machine? Or do we try to aspire to something better? Anyway, I love Sven's writing, and Changing the Subject is a wonderful book. It's published by Woolf Press, one of the best publishers out there. So give it a read and go back to Sven's earlier collections of essays as well as his memoirs, because he's just a great writer for our age. And I'm so glad he was free that Sunday afternoon and that he didn't text anyone or take a selfie during our podcast. Here's the bio from his new book. Sven Birkerts is the author of Changing the Subject and 9 previous books, including The Other Walk, The Gutenberg Elegies, The Art of Time and Memoir, and My Sky Blue Trades. He recently stepped down as director of Bennington Writing Seminars, and he also edits the journal Agni, based at Boston University. He lives in Arlington, Massachusetts. And now, the Virtual Memories Conversation with Sven Birkerts. So your new book is Why Can't We All Be Goddamn Luddites? Now, I'm just kidding.
Believe me.
But it's close, right? That was your new book.
We can work around that, yes.
Changing the Subject is the name of the most recent collection of essays. Right. Art and Attention in the Internet Age?
Very good.
Good.
Yes.
The fact that I could remember that a year plus later is
it's a terrific subtitle.
That I don't spend enough time goofing around on the Internet, which is
well, there you go.
Bad. How is your approach to digital technology and culture changed from the mid-'90s when you were when it was evolving and you had severe reservations?
A small question.
Just a little.
You'd ask. I think a good place to start is maybe just by pausing on the first part of the title, because it's kind of an obvious pun, and I think the second half of the pun is what in fact kind of describes the nature of the change or gradual evolution of the thinking, which is, if oneself is the subject, then all of this stuff has changed the subject. And so really I'm talking about all of the processes out there and all the things we do pretty much reflexively now, unthinkingly, automatically, that we didn't do 30 years ago. And they've moved in on us with magical invisibility, and obviously they have been wreaking their effects ever since. And I think the trick in this book, I guess I see it as the sort of partner piece, the second wave of thinking about this stuff, the first having been written in the face of the immediate arrival of all these technologies. So the Gutenberg elegies was kind of like, oh my God, what's this thing coming at us and what is it likely to do? And then there's a period of some 15 years or something that passes, and in that time it has moved in so fully that
it's like
the surprise element is gone now. Okay. So yeah, so now it's let's remember that this is pretty big, and let's ask what this might in fact be, how it might be impinging on us, because it's so total and seamless pretty much that we need to make ourselves ask, or else it's just the new given, which it is anyway. But since we still essentially pay lip service to a lot of things which are possibly no longer the case in the same way. I'm flashing outward now because I'm thinking the similar thing is obviously true in our political sphere, and it is, I think, very much related. We are still, especially in this political moment, paying lip service to a whole array of standard American or worldly verities of, this is what a politician must be, this is what, a position requires and involves, and it's all just being scrambled up.
Oh, disrupted is the business jargon term.
Yeah. And I think analogous things from the point of view of this particular book, Changing the Subject, it's somewhat similar. I think I'm old enough to really be able to identify having grown up in one era distinctly enough to be able to see where it began to change, and then to have lived enough into the next era to see how effectively it has changed. And I really think at issue is a certain understanding about selfhood, the way it's represented, the way we think of ourselves in terms of, the great coming of age movement of my life was, sort of the late 60s, 70s, very much about self-expression, individuality, claiming your unique identity. And even as that was all happening on a vast social front, this other process was already sort of underway in the garages and laboratories all over the country, creating this systemic technology which at every point really works against that. So there's a really interesting collision which is not immediately visible. And I don't pretend that I'm doing anything more in that book than sort of nibbling around the edges to try to make it a little more conspicuous, or at least to be able to talk about it in that way. And I'll stop talking in a minute and I'll interview you, but it does begin, the opening essay, it quotes the now overquoted Virginia Woolf line, on or about December 1910, human history changed forever, which she was referring, in fact, I think to a particular art exhibit or show which showed that human sensibility was altered. I'll have to read my book and see what it really was about. But it is that notion that there are these thresholds or shelves, I guess, where we go from having, incremental change to having some, more of a systemic moments of sort of transformation. And I do feel that, this last few decades has really very much been one of those.
Did you feel like you were committing any sort of betrayal the first time you got an iPhone?
My whole life. Anything I've done that is anywhere near electricity since writing the Gutenberg elegies has
carried with it a sense of betrayal.
Carried with it a certain sense of betrayal. And Yeah. I mean, and I have a standard, a whole elaborate set of defensive positions I take around it. The leading one of which is that it's really a camera that happens to have the capacity to
make phone calls
send
or
messages.
go to the internet.
I hardly ever use it as a phone.
No one does. They have a little computer that makes crappy calls.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I'd be lying if I said that my life was somehow, untainted. Yeah. It's as tainted as Donald Trump's.
Well, I remember in the...
I'm sorry, I'm not going to mention his name for the rest of the conversation.
In the one of the essays, I seem to recall you weren't carrying a cell phone, weren't using GPS, and were driving from here in Arlington out to Bennington to the low-res MFA program that you recently retired from running. I've driven that same route, and the idea of doing that without having some sort of emergency communication device in the middle of winter seemed absolutely nuts to me, given that, we all did that once upon a time when none of us had these sorts of devices. So I'm glad that you actually have something.
Well, you reminded me of one of my good excuses, which really is that I just came back this morning from visiting my 90-year-old parents out in Needham. We came to a point on the historical familial timeline where they needed to be able to reach me, or somebody needed to be able to reach me if and when one of them
if there's an emergency.
Tumble, which they have been taking with some regularity. So it comes on as a, oh no, it's for your own good. And then it completely takes over your life and destroys everything. It's a very important, useful tool to have on hand. It is, yeah.
I was reading someone, of course I can't remember because I read it online, who talked about the way the phone changes waiting. That we no longer complain that much about waiting online for things because we can just take out our phone and read something or play a game or watch a movie or whatever, which is probably all, again.
I sometimes think of that in terms of it has probably for the good of mankind displaced smoking, but I am so aware of the many occasions in my life which in an earlier day would have been the moment when you
pop out
go
a cigarette,
outside, light up and in a nice way, often consume that 5-minute interval between things.
And it would give you an excuse to leave a bad conversation in a restaurant. You could gotta go outside for a smoke and just walk the hell out.
So now all those people, and I see them walking everywhere, those used to be the same people, many of whom were doing that.
Although in between you get the e-cigarette thing also. So people can go
they should have a phone that has a little... If you can combine the e-cigarette
it's just a plug-in.
And the phone,
you plug in the back, and it could be the iPhone 8 that you're also allowed to smoke away with. Have you found your writing practice change as a result of going digital? And I know that's a long-term thing. Using a computer as a desktop writing tool first, but
I find that hard. I mean, I absolutely believe that it has. I just find it hard to measure because the process itself has always been in transition. It changed hugely when each time I became a father, it changed for many years after right away because of
time constraints.
And which meant that I approached any task differently. I approached it in segmented digestible bits. Now, the kids are out of the house. I have a laptop. I'm very inadept, I still use it in a hugely primitive way. I was just reading 10 Tips on Writing or something from Jeff Dyer before you came, just a little thing, and he was saying how he'd hate to have to get rid of his particular laptop because he's done so much work in creating all of the autocorrects.
Yeah, the whole personalizing it or customizing.
And I didn't even know what he was talking about. And I said, okay, this shows right away. I'm on AOL and I don't know what
I love the fact that you have an AOL email address. That just makes me so happy.
But that tells you where I am in the stream. I'm using it as a Well, sure. I mean, the place.
Well, it's a word processor.
Yeah, but I do want to break this down because it's interesting about the process of writing. I think if it had come along, if it had been the dominant existing technology when I was 17 or 18, just beginning to write, I think my writing possibly would be very different. I think that it came into my life when I was probably, closer to 40 or 40 plus. And I think the big thing that not working on a laptop is about had already been accomplished. I had already internalized whatever that is that you internalize when you simply retype the same page 5 times before you send it to an editor, because each time you look it over, there's something. A problem with it. So you've taken in a kind of awareness which changes hugely when you're suddenly working on a medium where you can at any point go back, move it, substitute. I was still working very much in terms of getting the line as close to being done in my head before I committed to the page, just because I'm lazy, I think I still have that, but I don't know if I would. I mean, I think
you would just keep trying variations and splatter stuff on the page.
Down on the page, yeah, that's very possible. So, I sometimes lament that I only have one foot in, because I'm sure there are a lot of sophisticated things that I could do with things in progress, with files, with versions of things. I finish it. If it goes somewhere, I delete it. It's gone. I don't have a relation to huge piles of...
You probably should hold on to the last versions of things just in case whoever publishes them goes under and you can never access things again. Yeah, that's... Or
I should just publish with places that are less likely to go under.
No one's less likely to go under.
I guess again,
that's that age of disruption that we're in.
That's true.
Only because I know a couple of writers who've gone through that sort of thing where they published at whatever internet startup for 5 years.
Well, I was lying a little bit.
You keep something? Okay.
I keep a few things, but I don't have those things that people are always saying, well, I went back and found the third version, whatever.
Oh, yeah, being able to version everything.
All of that's gone.
Well, that was actually, I used to publish Samuel Delaney back when I did small press publishing in the late 90s, early aughts. And we did a chapbook that was a giveaway if you bought the collection of letters that we published. And he would call every day with changes. And you had to keep and print out one each time because the library up in Boston that was keeping his papers had to have versions of every single thing. So eventually I just lied to him and told him, yeah, no, don't worry, Chip. I've got there's 10 versions of this over here. I'll print those out. In my workplace, I'll print out your semi-pornographic chapbook and hope nobody catches it before I grab the thing and staple it into it. Yeah, not a problem. I'll risk my job for your posterity. So.
I'm sitting here right now picturing the galley pages, both of Flaubert and Joyce, which we have, which are just black with rewrite. I mean, you can...
Yeah, I've seen the Joyce one.
Yeah,
I've seen
unbelievable.
Facsimiles.
And, but that makes you wonder how would he have taken to this?
Well, that's I remember reading years ago a complaint about authors' archives because they just won't exist in the same way. They'll just be computer files. Some guys rarely would print anything out, and so what does the manuscript consist of? In my case, the few times I've done fiction in the last bunch of years, I actually write longhand before typing. I found that sitting on a computer, I just start doing something else, or I start going back and rewrite. This way I was just, let me just start writing in longhand. Eventually I'll type it in and go through my neurotic self-correction and never get anything done later in the process instead of not getting anything done early in the process.
Yeah,
which is part of my being a failed writer, which I'm fine with. I always tell people this is my art. This is fine, but deep down, of course, it hurts. So I didn't tell you any of that. We
can go back and just erase that, right?
Oh yeah. I always tell people that don't worry. We'll just get rid of that part. But it goes in. Nobody ever listens to this, so it doesn't.
Oh, okay. We'll get rid of that too.
Now let me ask though, and this is another aspect of me failing Virginia Woolf, for some reason, I've never been able to read her well.
Well is the important word here.
Finish anything.
Oh.
Yeah. Outside of Mrs. Dalloway last year, early this year. Literally, possibly because a teacher in high school who thought he was advanced gave a bunch of 17-year-olds the waves.
Oh, well, that's...
Okay, so you had that reaction.
Right.
Okay. But for some reason, anytime I start her, it always feels like something I've been assigned as opposed to something I read for the joy of it. What do you read of Virginia Woolf that brings you joy? And what do you suggest?
I was very close to, and I actually have, sections and essays toward what at one point I imagined was going to be the next project following the changing the subject essays, and that was going to be a whole book of differently angled reflections, all growing out of a sustained reading of To the Lighthouse. I mean, that one book especially, not that there aren't millions of other things that she's done that are wonderful. That to me, I don't know, I'm not even sure if it's because of when it came in my life or just whatever's the intersection that caught. That book worked for me in a very deep way. And I do routinely go back to it. And it's one of those, everyone has their cliche book of every time I go back to it, it's a whole different book. It is that for me. And since, we're going around this basic... We can go to the subtitle now. We'll move from art and attention and whatever. I don't remember.
Art and attention in the internet age?
Yeah, that could be right.
Yeah.
Art and attention. Those three words, we're moving down to those now. I think that's what she achieves. If somebody said, art and attention, what do you think of? I would say, I think of Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. Attention in a very particular way, and I think I sort of poke around in different parts of the book at trying to get at this. And it, to me, has to do with the whole deeper nature of the quote-unquote artistic experience, which is that one doesn't have it while living in the standard disrupted, dissipated time stream that we live in. It changes you, or you change yourself enough to partake of something in a different mode, a different, I use the word durational, when I'm really caught up in a work of art. It need not be a novel. It could be, reading four quartets, or it could be listening to Mahler, or it could be looking at a Turner painting in a museum. Something, the moment, it's one thing to stand in front of it and go, wow, that's pretty. And then it's the other thing, which is when you find that you have gone over the threshold and you are, in fact, engaged by the, rhythms of the color and the repetitions and the pattern and the subject and, the whole thing. And then you step away and you don't quite know how long you were standing there. It's a bit of a trance. Slow, short trance, but a trance.
But a transcending yourself.
Yeah, and that's, I'm sure the words are not related, but it's perfect.
Yeah.
Trance and transcending. Exactly. So I think not only because there's something very affecting to me in Woolf's particular sort of lyric style, and I actually mean, whatever is her rhythmic frequency and her way of selecting certain details and her way of making transitions in moments of narrative. I mean, all those things to me are just, they play to me and they're very kindred, and the net effect of all that is that I have a very charged up attention experience, one which actually does feel that it, rejuvenates and sort of clears the soul out a little bit. And it's rare. I mean, books and books everywhere, but there aren't that many that achieve that. I mean, I can get other forms of transport, but the one that really feels subjectively transformative, which does have to do with attention and a certain kind of the bigger awareness of the world, which, you know, just suddenly happens in the middle of a sentence. You kind of get that whoosh, you know. Yeah. I get that with her.
Do you recall having that experience the first time you read it? Or is it something you grew into?
I think I had enough of it with that particular book. I think my later exposures have trained me to get it better. I get a better hit. Yeah. But in the beginning, I did, I think.
Do you remember how old you were when you were first exposed to it?
I was 3.
Yeah.
No, this was post-college, and it was a great beloved book of an early girlfriend. And so it stuck. That's why I know, because I hadn't read it yet. And then later I read it, and I sort of got what she got about it.
During the relationship or after you'd split?
After.
Yeah.
But I don't think that was the causal thing.
No, but did it make you think about it? Did it make you think, oh, if I had read this back when we were a thing, that would have changed our approach to X, Y, and Z? And not that I'm asking about lifelong regrets with an ex-girlfriend, but yeah.
You know, thoughts like that, sure. You understand, what you understand at moments like that is that if any other person is truly, if you know them to be truly passionate about something, whatever it is, on that level where they can really say, you know, such and such a book, piece of music, painting, that's not an idle fact about them. It's a central fact.
But it's one thing to say that in one's 20s as opposed to 40s, 50s, 60s.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I sort of pulled together enough that I intuited those things about that person, but I did it without having sort of touched the touchstone thing. And maybe I didn't touch it because I was afraid. You know, you don't want to find out that a book that somebody just utterly, values so much isn't doing anything for you. So there could have been some of
There is that flip side of back when I was single, early part of the century, there was, I was using an online dating site, which is how my wife and I met. And there were a couple of questions that you knew, they were basically criteria for avoiding women. One was a song you'd like to get it onto, but the big one was the last great book you read. And if a girl responded in certain ways, it basically, nope, that is not somebody I want to even meet for a date.
Question?
Oh, it generally wasn't that. It tended to be pop lit.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah. It would be Chuck Palahniuk's Fight Club. Like, yeah, that's not somebody I want to be spending an evening with.
Right.
Or David Sedaris at the time was the big
sure.
I was like, yeah, that's
But that always makes it tricky. I mean, because now especially part of the
everything's 5 stars.
Yeah, but also everything's a list culture. So the 10 books you got to read this summer, as if everyone has the same basic makeup and should hurry off to.
Yeah, these are the summer books. I need to read these.
You got to read them,
Yeah, and that's why it's always funny to me when I look over what I've read and try to figure out. Generally, it's I'd say 80% of my reading is centered around guests and making sure I'm prepared for a conversation.
But you're picking guests who you suspect you're going to want to read. Right?
Generally, yeah. I've gotten to a point where, and I've said this in the past. I don't feel bad turning down a publisher who wants me to interview their 30-year-old author who college, MFA, worked in publishing, wrote their first novel about college, MFA, and working in publishing. Yeah, that no longer, I don't have to do that. There's not enough money in this to justify, we need Roth on board,
Sure.
I'd prefer to sit down with Sam Gross and talk about cartooning for National Lampoon in 1971. And,
yeah, sure, absolutely.
But yeah, there's picking and choosing in that respect. There's also the people I have semi-pitched and then started to read and realize it's probably not somebody I should be following up with. So you just sort of let it lie fallow. But although again, this weekend was funny because I'm at a literary science fiction and fantasy convention, and it's a genre I like, or an overall area that I like, but I'm not deeply invested in it. And these are people whose, especially the older authors, their lives are completely immersed in this work. and the history of it, and the long form of the history of SF as a genre, from the 20s onward, the various periods of magazines, all of which I find very interesting, but I don't know and don't follow, and it's kind of great. Seeing it like a subculture is interesting to me. But sometimes they act as though I actually know what they're talking about, and that's always a problem. So,
are you talking about? Is this a culture that you're mainly looking at it on the page form? I'm just wondering if this
generally,
is overlapping with gaming culture, serious gaming culture. If this is the same.
Oh, you mean role-playing games and that world and video stuff? No, stuff. These are generally, especially the guys I tend to talk to, they're older. It's not really part of gaming. It's very much the page, the print culture, the print science fiction. I mean, short stories and novels, and the world around that. And I see it also with mystery writers, although I have very little entree into that world. Reading Donald Westlake's nonfiction miscellany, and there's an essay in there, or a speech he once gave on the history of what he calls detective fiction, and the waves of it in terms of who the practitioners were, what the magazines and then the publishers were. Right. There are parallels and divergences from the science fiction side of things, but it's very interesting that both of those genres know themselves. Or at least they did. And in recent years, that's a bit of a knock that the younger generation, but every younger generation's like this, the younger generation doesn't know their history.
That's interesting. That's actually, the idea.
Yeah, that's not like quote-unquote literary fiction, which we both know what we're talking about.
It's already balkanized severely.
Yeah, and they know where they come from and what their roots are. And it's very interesting because it's almost in living memory. There's a guy like Robert Silverberg within the science fiction field who isn't not old enough to have published in the early days, but was published by the guys who were publishing in the early days. So you still have that sense of living memory. Whereas, again, literary fiction becomes this
absolutely,
all-encompassing, eternal canonical thing. But enough about me. You're retiring. Well, you have retired from one gig.
Yeah, I've been. That's a loaded word for me. So
you're stepping down. Is stepping down better than retiring in this? And talk about what we're talking
down,
about.
Definitely, just because of the accrued associations of retirement for me, which are, the cliched American,
kicking back, moving to the
dad's
beach.
Just sitting around the house with nothing to do and playing a lot of golf and driving his wife crazy. I still have one. Well, actually, I'm taking a year off of teaching.
Yeah, tell me what you do and professionally and what the status is of these various roles.
Yeah, I mean, the part that's changing vis-a-vis Bennington is that I'm not the director anymore, and I worked out a arrangement where starting next June I'll return to be what I started doing, which is a nonfiction faculty member.
And this is the low residency MFA.
Yeah, the low residency MFA. So a year off from teaching, which is the first time I've had that for 30-some years, because I've been, teaching various other places before Bennington, and there's always been a pile of papers somewhere, and there isn't one right now, which is really interesting. Is
it a good feeling, or is it a weird?
It's working toward being a good feeling. It's a little bit unsettled, just because that was always the. It accelerates your having to face what it is that you're really doing, because when you have a stack of papers, there's always that to kind of. Well, I'll finish these and then I'll see if there's any time left. That distraction is gone. I have other distractions. I mean, I still
got an iPhone now.
I have the iPhone, and I go into Agni every day for a few hours. So work, editing, reading submissions, and doing all that, which gets me out of the house for a while. But definitely, it is occasioning a cliched soul searching.
Yeah. Had you been anticipating that?
Slowly building toward it. And it has, everything to do with it has everything to do with writing, and it has everything to do with wanting to get back to a certain level of involvement. And the last few pieces I've written, just essays, have been in a way either about the difficulty of writing at a certain point in your life when you've consumed many subjects, and so it's a version of the writer's block essay, but there's definitely that, and then just essays kind of mulling the question, I suppose. My sense of who I am and how I fit into a writing life. Again, it's been going on long enough so that there are phases, but the most vivid phase of it was the first 15 or so years, when a huge part of the motivator, maybe not talked about enough, is just ambition. The tremendous desire to put yourself in front of people as doing something, and hustling with a lot of energy to find ways to do that. And Kafka wanted to squeeze the slave out of him drop by drop, and at a certain point in my life, I wanted to squeeze that out of my life. I began to feel that was getting in the way, that it was too much.
Driving you to write in a certain way?
Yeah. And I made a big switch. I mean, writing for the whole first half of my life, when my quote-unquote writing life, which sounds so pretentious, was all reviews and review essays, and just taking up assignments and looking for them and trying to find ones that rhymed and matched so they could eventually build into sections of books. And that coincided with what were still the glory days of American newspaper and magazine reviewing, when
there was actually money to be made.
There was money to be made. There were gigs and venues everywhere, and one could figure out how to do it and get on with one's business. And that changed at a certain point, because I did sort of eventually discover the enormous and in some ways, problematic repetition factor. I mean, I could always persuade myself that I was really busy and on to the next worthy task with the next pile of books in front of me. But then I realized that what I was doing was getting to be a little bit, I was trying to make an opinion heard, and I was following what, alas, unfortunately, are the, handful of template modes for doing it.
Yeah, I was going to say, did you feel like it was a sort of assembly line? Was it like Orwell's take on book reviewing? In terms of you never have time to actually read the books. You're too busy.
Well,
yeah.
Well, that changed too. I mean, in the beginning, the reading end of it was furious, and then as one moves along and the things
I could probably write this after one chapter. Yeah.
Right. No,
I'll skim
well, no.
Oh,
no.
Good.
I would say that was a given that you had to have read the thing you're reviewing. But in the old days, you'd read the 3 or 4 books around it, the earlier work and all of that. And then at a certain point, you just couldn't do that anymore. And, and then the reviewing itself, it's just, you realize after a while that you're not touching an enormous part of your thinking self. And I started to get very much more interested in sort of what else is going on in my mind other than my reactions to the new so-and-so novel. And so there's a switch into essay writing, and that sort of began to it continued and it sort of sped up, and so it sort of moved from essays and sort of reflections of this sort of Gutenberg elegy stripe, which were, I was looking at all these topics that had become interesting. And then this was when I was getting to be probably about your age. How old are you?
46.
Exactly. It's exactly when it
Boom,
started.
there it is.
and this is something I have, tried to explain to students, and they often don't understand if they're younger, and they do understand if they're older, in their own fashion. But I discovered that really fascinating thing, which was the doubling over of one's own experience, so that it's just as you're going along and having things happen to you with just increasing volume and regularity, they are throwing you back to earlier versions of something similar, or creating this associative set of little explosions that just were not happening when I was 39 or 42. And suddenly everything became saturated with this sense of my life having themes, recurrences, motifs, and then it's as if on some kind of command, the whole sunken continent of memory began to detach from the seafloor and kind of start coming up. And so all of a sudden I was spending a huge amount of time, and with much interest, remembering things. I said, oh, God, that became interesting. And with that, it became very possible, as it hadn't been before, to start thinking of the whole course of the life as being a kind of thematic puzzle. Mm-hmm. The kind of thing, that Nabokov just goes crazy over in Speak Memory or something, but, all of a sudden everything has a little design in it. And so that definitely was a huge turning point, pushed me into autobiographical writing, and I did a memoir, and then I did a book about memoir, how this sort of worked in a way in terms of the craft of recovering and narrating one's own experience. And then that sort of led to a more sort of lyric excursions, sort of short pieces that were kind of outtakes, in a sense, from sustained memoir, but they were just episodes. So I did that, So there's been a huge movement from dutiful reviewing of big books. And interestingly enough, the first piece I ever published in the first book review was in the Boston Review, and it was on Robert Musil in This Man.
The Man Without Qualities?
Yeah. So that was the first essay, sort of literary essay, and that sort of... but anyway, it was dutiful. I mean, I still like it, but the person who wrote it was very set on impressing a whole host of venerated elders, and they were everywhere. Mm-hmm. They were really a quarry to be gone after.
And what with the modernist project of Musil, that sort of makes sense to...
So, this is an entree kind of thing. But over time, the dutiful thing began to wear off and become almost something that was a problem. And the elders have all died off, or a lot of them have, and suddenly...
or you realize you're
becoming one. You are one. Yeah, sure. Your students address you as Mr. Chips in a kind of, with a deference that you don't deserve.
Oh, well, the imposter syndrome thing is, if there's any unifying element to 200 plus episodes, it's that every guest I have thinks they're a fraud.
Totally fraudulent, yeah.
But as it turns out, everybody else is a fraud too. And that's why it's no big deal. That's how you get over it.
That may be the thing that...
Off mic, I'll tell you a story about that. That's how I realized in my own professional life that I'm a fraud, but everyone else is too, so it's okay. But yeah, we'll get into that later. Had you done therapy at all? Had that been part of the midlife recovery thing? I never have, and I don't know.
Not in a big way. I'm married to a therapist, so
by extension,
certainly in the air. And there was a phase when it was not long lasting, and I don't know what its results were. A dabble. There was a year or so of trying this out, but not in the way that
with
people
a specific problem trying to...
No.
Okay.
No.
Yeah, I wasn't sure with the, as you mentioned, the recovering, the seeing the patterns, et cetera. Because
but no, it's
I've never done that and had to work on it manually. And when it's your own mind, it's a little tough to parse.
Yeah, no, I know. And that's actually a good analogy, and there's probably more in it than I'm allowing. But
What were your essayistic influences? I mean, everybody has Montaigne to fall back on, but when you started working in that personal essay style, that mode,
I think I was a good deal more.
Philip Lopate, perhaps, or
well, he certainly came into the picture at some point. I'd say the people who I was really sort of wowed by at the point when I started doing this were, I liked sort of literary writers. I really liked George Steiner and Randall Jarrell and Elizabeth Hardwick. And I will say Susan Sontag, even though I now feel like repudiating a lot of that because I don't have the same estimate that I had when I was first sort of...
Those things always fascinate me. Not just the ones who we used to hold in high esteem but no longer do, but the authors of books that we hated once upon a time that we've grown into realizing, I was a moron. Yeah, that's actually indispensable in my life.
Along with the imposter syndrome, I was a moron phenomenon. Yeah. I came under, sort of a very immediate and pressurized influence. I was living in Ann Arbor, and the Russian poet Brodsky had been just recently come to America, gone to Ann Arbor, was just starting to teach, and I was working in a bookstore at the time, and I met him and got to know him a little and began to audit his classes. He became a kind of friend, but he became a great dispenser of names and wisdoms. So he was always saying, you must read, I won't even try the Russian accent, you simply must read, Karl Lowell. You simply must, So there was this enormous phase, several years, where I was just, I was in a bookstore and I was just getting these names flying at me, and I was going at them in no organized progression with little sense of hierarchy or who came first or so on. But yeah, there were a lot of literary critics and poets and a lot of Farrar, Straus, and Giroux authors. I mean, that list for a while was kind of biblical for me. It's just like, who's Farrar, Straus doing now? They must be great.
And that was, and I've told this story before, but I tend not to get freaked out or over impressed. But going to record with Jonathan Galassi and going into the FSG, and this is the newer FSG offices, and not the ones on Union Square. But yeah, just walking in and having the holy shit, just the all the certificates of the Nobels, the Pulitzers, et cetera, and it's like, God damn, this is a life I maybe could have working in publishing, not creating anything of lasting value. But yeah, a world where I could have pursued instead of trade magazines.
And and Brodsky in particular, he somehow managed to be personally had injected himself into it in a very deep way. So you could be sitting there talking, the phone rings, and he says, "Look, Czesław, I can't talk," kind of, and on and on. I mean, the person who met him in Vienna was odd, and on and on and on. He just, and that infected me with a kind of wow. I mean, I just got a.
Did you have let me ask? Did you have a desire to be one of those nexus points?
Oh, yeah.
And did you pursue that in your role at Bennington in terms of bringing writers, instructors in who,
I as much as, well, I think by the time the Bennington thing came around, some decades had gone by. I mean, certainly I thought
but that impulse
of
never
the
leaves.
position as a pulpit of sorts. I mean, more of a, trying to invite in people that I hugely admired. And so, had a whole roster of great guests come through, and it was one of the perks of the job to be able to put out the feeler and, see if Andre Osserman wanted to come, or Jeff Dyer, or David Shields, just on and on. A lot of people came through over the years, and they'd be there for 2 days, and you get an intensified little hangout, everybody milling around, and then they'd leave, and the next person would come. But it had its own sort of late night talk show kind of dynamic going.
Well, I was telling people, it's like this. I get an hour or two in people's lives and have these nice conversations, and they never find out how irredeemably shallow I really am, because this is the only exposure they
I don't know if you.
I know you're all talking about me behind my back.
Totally.
But, that's that secret Twitter group where they all just convey direct messages about me.
See, I remember meeting you because I remember sitting in the dining hall at Bennington, and David Gates came up and said,
"Some schlub from
I'm
New
gonna
Jersey.
Bring this guy over. He's going to do an interview." And I remember.
Yeah. And then I was telling someone about that meeting this weekend because I drove up 3 hours to sit down with Gates, and we'd corresponded and had talked a few times over the years. But went up there. He felt guilty about, you drove 3 hours just to talk to me? I'll take you to lunch. You can meet some of the other faculty. And that's where Lopate and Trachtenberg and Susan Cheever and everybody else came from. I actually
Well, you're plucking the nonfiction genre here. Those are all my people.
It's a weird thing for me. I find fiction writers, it's hit or miss. Yeah. It's tougher to talk to someone about their novel than it is to talk to a nonfiction writer or essay writer.
Well, because you have to make sense.
You have to not ask where'd you get your ideas from.
Well, you have to ask, right. But also, they are most able to respond, I think. I hope I'm not.
No, tell me, you're
really stupid. The nature of writing and creating, scenic fictional material it's hard to extrapolate from, because it bears down. It's centripetal. It's not centrifugal. And so if you're going to talk to so-and-so, you really, and I find this when I read interviews with writers, with fiction writers, either the question is, who are some of your influences? And then there's the gossip chain of, oh yeah, I was at Iowa with blah, blah, and he was great, and we got drunk. Or, in your blah, blah, you have that scene where Caleb, smashes his grandmother. Or something.
Is this the same thing your father did? And
yeah. But I don't know that too many fiction writers are that interested in theorizing the genre.
Yeah.
And that kind of, maybe they are, and I just
haven't hit the right ones.
Haven't hit the right ones, but.
And again, it's I think of a piece with what we were talking about with science fiction or other self-aware genres, that there might be a little bit more along those lines. But yeah, the conversation tends to turn more towards becoming a writer, understanding markets, finding an audience for your work. Whereas nonfiction, you can focus on the subject matter of the nonfiction in some respects. So this is all stuff that has revealed itself to me over the course of 200 plus.
And fiction writers' books that are not fiction tend to be about craft. So they're great about discussing the creation of character, of suspense, but I don't see and maybe that's why I was liking so much to read, back then, George Steiner, he's too florid for me now, but James Wood does a lovely job of stepping outside and bringing together both the feeling of what the craft of the genre is, but then putting it into an intellectual context and playing it off schools, trends, tendencies, and all that. He does that so well, and he would be an instance of someone I was very glad to be able to invite up, and then once we hooked him on the narcotic of drumming,
because at Bennington you also have the we should know Bennington has the low-res MFA program has a
house band.
House band, yeah. Well, I forget the
name.
I forget the name now. It's about the
doghouse band.
The doghouse band, with David Gates on guitar and whoever else is cycling through. But yeah, I when I saw James Wood was there the last time I went up. 2 summers ago.
Yeah, he was up this June. He's probably been up 5 or 6 times. Yeah. He would come up just to drum for a night, but we were usually able to be
to get
creative and see if he wanted to do a craft seminar or a Q&A or something. So, but that was kind of thing that I loved to be able to do, was to bring in an admired.
Just with his Keith Moon fixation, I was just worried that he might trash whatever dorm you put him in and storm out in that full 1970s rock and roll mode.
Right.
Were there instructors who impacted you as a writer over the course of your interactions with them
In my
at Bennington?
at Bennington.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Were there instructors you brought into Bennington with whom your interactions ended up, kind of changing the way you wrote, or for better or worse, impacted what you did?
I don't think in that sense. I don't think in terms of the...
Not that you were handing Lopate hey, can you read this for me? But,
Right. It was less that. It was more the kind of influence. It's on a different level, I guess. The teaching up there is almost always, it's workshop teaching, and almost without exception, it's team-taught workshops. So every time you're at a residency, you have a partner, a workshop partner, and so they have their 5 students, you have yours, and you have the 5 full long sessions of going over the work. There are 2 places where the influence and excitement come in on the level you're talking about. One is, and this has been hugely gratifying, is working with brilliant teachers. Not all of whom many of whom were in place when I took over, and a few who I was able to bring in. Each one is a completely, even though you're doing the same essential thing, the same discussion model, it's just as you get to know a person's intellect and sensibility over a period of these, fairly intense, every other day sessions, and you see how other people read, and you extrapolate from what you know of their writing, and you listen to them talk, and I think that's been a huge influence, though I wouldn't say it has showed up in any direct fashion in the writing, but it's been a sustaining thing. The other is, just going to the readings at night, and everyone is putting their best foot forward, and it's always either guests or faculty, and so it's just a terrific showcase that, it's hard to go to bed afterwards, because you've just been wowed by two people reading, depending on the genre, but, and those are the moments when I know I can picture myself walking back to wherever I'm staying afterwards, and kind of having that feeling of, well, this is why I do this, just that kind of sustaining certainty. Mm-hmm. It's worth something. It matters in the culture. It seems to in that way, because we're in a closed system, as you know, up there on the hill, and it creates an illusion which I don't know that I experience as intensely anywhere else, which is, 10 nights, night after night, in a room, absolutely packed, 100+ people listening, 2 really good writers, and you begin to believe that this is a force in the world. Whereas in daily life, I suppose I could go down to Porter Square Books or Newtonville Books and see so-and-so read from their new novel, and meet a few people who are writers and say hi to some people, but it's not the same. So one needs to sustain, build, whatever, uphold this idea in the life that this is not a hobby, it's not a lightweight enterprise. It means something, artistic expression at this level that we're hoping for is a force. It changes minds, it affects people's lives. Which brings us back to Virginia Woolf and attention, and that there are certain things that have that power. So it's on the behalf, in the service of that power, I think, that one tries to operate. And there are so many distractions and things that dilute it that it's not always easy.
I think I know I've rambled about it on the show in the past. My reaction post-election, which was immediately to be disheartened, but I think over the course of the morning walk with my dog, remembered the end of Calvino's Invisible Cities, and if everything is the Inferno, then what's the point of doing anything? And his response to that in terms of the, find the things that aren't Inferno, and
Yeah.
Make them grow, or at least get them space. Which, again, you're also talking to a guy who's spending his weekend running around the Massachusetts area recording hour-plus conversations with people because he's fucking nuts. But, I mean, because he's trying to preserve the culture. Yes, that's... I also tell people, and this sort of ties back into your work in terms of technology and distraction. This is two people not looking at a screen. Mm-hmm. And anytime I get, and I was asked this weekend a few times, I can't record with you now, but can we do one by Skype? I was like, no. Because you will goof around on the internet. I will goof around on the internet. We will be doing something other than just looking at each other and talking.
Sure. Did you notice? I just realized I haven't.
I didn't realize it was over there.
It's been sitting there, but I did not. I forgot it was there.
I usually
so good was the conversation.
Throw it on the floor, but no, it's going downhill. You can tell me it's okay. No, I usually leave mine like off to the side or on the floor or something, just because. Well, frankly, my life isn't so busy that anybody's calling or texting anyway. So.
Oh my gosh!
But you have kids, so that's a different situation. True. That's the way the student over the time you've been at Bennington, how have the students changed, or what's the is there something that characterizes the students in particular?
There's a easy and approximate answer to that because I mean I've been there the whole time, so I've been there 22, 23 years, whatever it was, many years before directing, and I was there when there were 20 students. I was there when there were 110, and I'm there when there are 80 something. I think it was founded both in the remnant spirit of the counterculture, and when it was founded, Liam Rector. I don't know if did you ever?
No.
He was a true character. He was a force. And I don't know how much you know of the story that I took over because Liam killed himself.
No.
Yeah, and it was.
Was there a curse or anything weird?
Well, I've been worried. This happened. I mean, it happened in the month of August, 10 years ago from this August. It was very sudden, and there was a enormous scramble, as you'd expect. Like, we're about to start the new admissions period in 3 weeks. We don't have a director. A quick plug-in. I had been there so long that I was
you knew how it worked.
Choice. I had some sense of how it worked, and so I came in interim for a while, and then I made it more official. There was a search, and I put my hat in and all that. Anyway, Liam was a poet. He was a troubled figure in some ways. He was a massive energy and conviction, and he was very much a product of the the great counterculture era of excess and self-determination, and the program was founded in that spirit as a sort of alternative arts community. It's the first years when it sort of grew to its first maturity, it was still drawing on that spirit which was still in the air. And so the people who came were not coming in order to get certified for anything. They came because they wanted to write. Yeah. They had projects going. From the start, there was always this sort of adult population. We weren't getting the 25-year-olds, or not too many. We were getting people in their 30s, 40s, 50s who wanted to get back to something they'd started, and so on. So there was definite vibe culture that got established through that, and I'd say it remains, but it remains in a somewhat altered form. I think cultural changes, economic changes, demographic pressures, all these things have made it a much more we've become much more officialized than we used to be. It used to be pretty wild.
Yeah.
Still little hints here and there, but it used to be quite a crazy chaos of things, with Barry Hannah taking up residence for a week and just, being Barry,
yeah.
and on and on. Now people are up there. A lot of them are wanting their credit. They want to finish their novel. They want to find the agent. They want to move into the publishing culture. it's very much more purposeful in that way. Not that there aren't quite a few who just are up there because they want to explore or further their writing, but there is that other. And in order to compete with the enormous, the competition that's sprung up in the last 20 years in the MFA world there were 5 places or so when I started. Now there are, a bazillion. So every program has to have its slate of offerings. We give you this, we bring in publishing professionals. That didn't used to exist. So it has morphed the program, which still remains, so wonderful and has a tremendously long-lived and committed faculty that has just gone on and helped to keep this identity in place, I think.
And was there, when you talk about people trying to get a career, not career boost, but launch a career as part of this, you mentioned working in workshop mode. Is there any professional placement, like you mentioned, bringing in publishing people? Or is it more just the interaction with the instructors who are of a necessity within the publishing world? Yeah, it's that level of networking.
It's mainly the latter. There's always an effort once or twice in the residency to, have an agent come in or somebody who publishes a small press or a magazine editor, or somebody come in, talk for an hour, and mill around with students. But that's not a huge element. I think the culture of the instructor-student relationship is the main point of contact, and it's all devious. It's not devious. It's informal, and it's not something you can engineer, but it happens. It just naturally happens if you're got a tremendously talented student and you see where that student's headed and you can give them some names or mention them to some people. You might, but you can't promise that to every student. Not all of them are ready. Not all of them need it. But there is that. And so anyone who goes through has worked with, 4 writers, all of whom, have contacts and some life out in the publishing world. And I think the nature of the student-instructor relationship is intensive enough and ongoing enough to allow for, things like that.
Is there a degree of having to burst their bubble about what publishing is, or do they figure that out from seeing David Gates for
they figure
days?
I think it's more about trying to repair the bubble. In some ways, it's a funny thing. There is, we know the big truth of publishing. We've always known it's really tough. It's hugely competitive, and it's often discouraging. And then you have a writing program, and in order to sell it, you're constantly doing PR about, those people who are your success stories. And it does create, you're touting your faculty as success stories. When a student makes it and publishes a book, you're touting that. Yeah. So there is, you're selling this idea of yes, we can. And it is really hard to come in and say...
But the odds.
Yeah. And I do a thing. I did it once, and I was almost going to do it again this past June. I went in there with my laptop, and I offered a 1-hour sort of discussion session on editing a literary magazine and what it's really like and what you can really expect. And so I brought my laptop, had it hooked up to the big screen, and I just pretty much showed them a little bit of a day in the life. And the truth of the day in the life is that you'll get, on a normal, midweek day, I will come in and find 100 submissions, during reading period, which is 9 months of the year. The odds are minuscule. Any issue has, 40-something pieces in it. You multiply that 100 out over months and months and months, and they have all those questions. Well, what about my cover letter? I just forget your cover letter. Yeah. The first thing you've got to do is to, write that first sentence that I just can't not read. And then the next thing you have to do is write that second sentence that lives up to that, and then just keep going until you're done. To fill me with that feeling of I've got to reach this person, I've got to get a hold of this piece. We want it. And this is something I'm very much aware, sort of having these two related but different jobs. Is on the one hand, I'm running I keep speaking in the present tense, I was running a sort of workshop-driven MFA culture, and on the other hand, I was the filter, the receiving point of the gatekeeper of MFA prose and poetry, but, and it is so clear how few pieces manage to step aside from MFA competence. I mean, I see so much competent work, and I'd say, well, okay, we knowing the truth of this, I can't be promoting that over here, and so, but the MFA, I mean, I believe in it, we're trying to make writers. On the other hand, they can't believe that they're going to walk out of here, and unless they've discovered some other extra potency, it's going to be a tough sell. The people who make it are the ones who, here's the bar that says very good MFA writer, and here's where you need to be for the next step. So you got to sort of help them get to that.
Yeah. I mean, I was crushed the last time I went up 2 years ago and met Lee Clay Johnson, because his first novel was fantastic, and he's this giant guy who's built like a brick shit house and good looking and very pleasant, polite, and an affable human being. So
and a
really,
good bass player, you might throw that.
Yeah, he was also playing bass in the Dogcat. So basically, everything just made me feel terrible about myself, not him.
We got to work on this.
Yeah, I know. I read Nitro Mountain. I was like, God damn.
If it's any consolation, Lee makes me feel that way too. I say, damn, I wish I was young and I wish I was Lee. Kind of.
Yeah, and my wife said the same thing about me.
He's probably thinking, I wish I was old and I wish I was Sven, but I don't know that.
He was saying that to me the entire time.
Right, there you go.
I'm hoping to get him on, but he's also so polite and self-effacing. He doesn't believe he's smart enough to do this podcast. I told him, that's really, I'm completely shallow. I pretend that I'm smart, but he hasn't figured that out yet.
That'd be interesting. I'd like to hear that one.
I did see him do a reading along with Gates at David Gates in Brooklyn when Nitro Mountain came out, and that was,
yeah,
that was something
stuff for sure.
Have you thought of doing fiction?
I started wanting to do fiction. My first quote unquote identity before I began reviewing books was I moved to Boston to write my novel.
Yeah. About the Civil War?
Took a room, just about. It was back during. I just come back from the Civil War. I rented a little room in Alston and went there every day and pegged away, wrote a novella. I needed to do that in order to just get that was not my exact shtick. And I think what I discovered in trying to write fiction was that I was using fiction as and Robert Musil comes into this too. I was using it as a
vehicle for ideas.
Scaffolding. All I could create were characters who were relentlessly ruminative, who basically did nothing but sat in their room smoking and thinking about things.
Yeah, they were philosophizing.
They were writing essays.
Yeah.
Marked off with little episodic. He went to the bathroom and came back. Why is life like this? He wondered, going on, So it was such a huge frustration to realize I couldn't do that, and it was such a huge compensating liberation when I thought, I'll just try this instead.
I'll get rid of the quotation marks.
Yeah, right, sort of. And it just is fitting that, the first thing that came my way, this says something about the reviewing world or how it used to be. I've been, ever since getting my BA a million years ago, I didn't go on to school. I went into the book business. There was about 10 years where that was my dominant means of support, either in Ann Arbor or in Boston, or as a free agent hustling used and rare books. But this was a big part of the early life. And one of the things that happened was I encountered all sorts of weird and interesting things. And sometimes you would find something like finding Musil and thinking, God, this is really good. Going out to see what had been written about it. I wanted to read about him. You know, we didn't have the...
Again, just about to say, there's no internet, so you have to... And
really...
I was around in that period. My college was 90 to 93, and it was still when I got turned on to William Gaddis, I had to go start looking up resources on William Gaddis in a library and figure out,
get really good with all those sort of volumes in the library that give you the sources and magazines and so on. But I discovered there was almost nothing on Musil. And that was, the little glimmer of the light bulb. I had the books, I'd read them, I thought they were really interesting, and there was nothing on him. So the only two missing parts, one is I'd have to write something, and then the second was to find some place to have it. But when I was talking about the great era of newspapers and magazines, I had just come to Boston, and there was a thing which exists now in a much transformed mode, the Boston Review. Back then it was called the New Boston Review, and it was strictly literary. And what they did was they published long literary essays for which they paid exactly nothing. So I just wrote this piece, and I put it in an envelope, and I walked it over to their offices on Sacramento Street, pushed it through the slot, and a couple weeks later, got some kind of contact that said, from the then editor, a woman named Gail Poole, she said, I really like this, we'll print it, and is there anything else you'd like to write about? And in all these years of being a, bookseller, I had a roster of my true favorites. And at this point, Virginia Woolf was not on that roster, but Malcolm Lowry was next. I desperately wanted to write about Malcolm Lowry, and Max Frisch was in there, and there are all these people that I thought were just so cool that there was not that much about them. And so that's what I began doing, is writing these pieces, and they were of I realized after a while that they were of an ilk and that they actually fit together because they were almost all non-Americans at that point. So I was writing about literature in translation, and there was apparently a market for that kind of writing. And at some point I had enough for a book, and it was possible to publish a book.
It sounds like you're describing an alien planet.
I know.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, a hardcover book from William Morrow consisting of essays on relatively obscure European writers, which then miraculously got reviewed in the New York Times by somebody who became quite important to me later, who I didn't really know then, but Donald Hall reviewed it. Years later, I worked with Don Hall as his co-writer on Writing Well, his textbook. And then he was already, unbeknownst to me, this was decades before Bennington. But when it started, Don Hall and Liam Rector were great friends. And he was a regular, almost every residency, Don would come up and spiel and read, and in the beginning he came up with Jane Kenyon, and then Jane died, and then he just come up. And
he's one of the guys I sort of regretted. I pitched, but I can't talk for more than 20 minutes, Gil, so no. I was like, okay.
Yeah, when did you pitch? Because that sounds like a lie. He
can't
shut him up.
The last 2 or 3 years, he'd said, it was when that last collection came out.
Yeah. See, he does this. I mean,
does he need to be prodded?
Tricked because he would say, well, we'd invite him to come up to a residency. He'd only come in summer because he didn't want to drive or be driven in winter anymore. And he'd come up and say, he'd be all these, provisos. I can't talk. I'll talk for 10 minutes, then maybe answer 3 questions and read a poem. I'd say, fine, Don, just come up.
And then 2 hours later,
get in front of the mic. Oh, yeah, no, I remember. You couldn't shut him up. Stop. Everyone wants to go to lunch.
I need a pee break. For God's sake, stop. Yeah.
Yes.
Is there someone, who do you regret who you would have loved to have gotten into the program but died in, memory of the time? Like somebody you would have pitched if you had the time, but too late, as opposed to like Dickens,
Oh man, I'm sure. I mean,
like great prospects, or people you'd still love to bring in nowadays.
Well, I
still
have a
directing.
huge regret around not because we're quite friendly, but he was just so busy and famous. I never pushed the point. But Seamus Heaney would have been
Sure.
terrific up there, and I would have loved to inveigle him with some kind of week-long retreat and set him up, because that would have been one person. There's so many that I'm going to now.
I know you're going to feel bad afterwards. Gil, I should have said.
I should have said.
Yeah.
Right.
If I can't inspire regret in people, I feel like I failed. So really, that's what this question's about.
I'm gonna sort of
just say
sidle around that, except to say that I know that I just had lists and lists of.
But Haney's a great one. That's a very good example.
He can stand definitely as an example. And
I get the guests who I pursued mildly who died, like David Carr.
Mm-hmm.
We had talked about doing one. I'm kind of busy now, but get back to me in a couple of months. Every so often I drop him a line, never hear back, and then he was gone. On the plus side, though, I did get David M. Carr, another David Carr teaches at Union Theological Seminary. I got him last summer, so I felt like that was nothing at all remotely connected. But but there are guests who or just people I've been interested in who I never. On the other hand, I also travel to England to get Clive James and
he in an ideal world, he would have been just a pure delight to have up there and just. Listen to him for a couple of days straight,
which he's capable of.
Yeah. That's something I did. I mean, I not only enjoyed the podcast, but it sent me to. I mentioned walking back from readings at Bennington and having trouble going to sleep.
The fizzing brain.
Yeah. So what I would do, not having any other media, I would have my laptop, and I would just get in bed and watch YouTube videos. And there was one residency for sure when I just got hooked on the Clive James, the British,
the talk
shows,
show.
Just over and over. Those were kind of my solace up there. Then I got hooked on videos about photographers, and, William Eggleston videos and things. But
do you learn to Netflix binge, or are you not quite a?
Oh, no stranger to it. Yeah, I mean, we tend to.
Once again, does it feel like a betrayal of everything I'm kidding.
Yeah, no, I mean, it depends.
I know you never wanted to be I'm the non-internet guy, but
right,
that's
even
sort of
though I
what
did
the literary culture put
set
you
myself up as that. So yeah, no, there's this last half year obviously it's been a lot of, every night is with regret and obsessiveness. You watch a couple hours of the pundits, going back and forth over who knew Kislyak and whatever.
Yeah.
I fell in with. I like engrossing, often foreign series like Borgen. And do you know that series?
I know of it, but I haven't watched it.
It's terrific. There are quite a few that came out of the troubled North. I fell in with the detective. What's his name?
Hankel's.
But not
Wallander.
But the original,
not
Wallander.
the Ken Branagh, but the
the Branagh. Though I watched that too,
my wife did also to compare and contrast, and read the novels because.
Yeah, see, I didn't go that far.
Yeah.
Again, it was more out of a feeling like maybe I got the better end of it through good televised.
You don't have to read the book. Yeah. It's okay. It's.
There are many things. I've been saying this a lot, so I must be reaching the age of regret. Which you still have plenty of time left. I know, but I see how much pleasure people get from Wimbledon, and I say, damn, I wish I was the kind of person who had gotten up enough interest in tennis so that I could be one of them, because they're having a blast, just watching this.
When I interviewed Ben Yagoda early this year, Federer and Nadal were in the finals, I guess in the Australian, because that would have been February. So yeah, they were the Australian, and or late January, and he had taped it because he was going to be busy that morning and wanted to watch it after, and I didn't realize this and was about to inadvertently say who had won the match. God. And when he's like, I haven't watched it yet, I said, then in that case, a great legend managed to to his legacy because Federer or Nadal, that was fine. So he just
But it's interesting now that came up. I didn't, but I've never been able to particularly get tennis from sitting and watching the ding, 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 ding. There was a. I
think this ties into your hatred of David Foster Wallace.
No, we're coming to Wallace.
Oh, good. Okay.
Because there's a book of pieces commissioned on different aspects of Wallace and different parts of his work. And for some reason, I either volunteered or it fell to me to write a short kind of close reading of his essay on Federer. And so I approached this as a complete naif. I was just relying only on what Wallace was able to show and do. And that's the closest I've ever gotten to tennis. And it's probably false. I mean, it's his enormous theorizing intellect is getting in front of the ball. And yet there's something that...
the point with Federer in particular, and from Wallace, now I've only read Infinite Jest and some of the essays, and you could say that's too much. But with Federer, you get the antithesis of the giant power game of tennis. So the fact that it's someone who is immensely graceful and just knew how to get to the right spot and just drop the ball in the right place instead of serving at 130 miles an hour. Or being like Nadal and having this enormous backhand that would just smash the living hell out of the ball. You can make that case a little more. You can over intellectualize it at least because it is clearly a thought out game as opposed to an overpowering game.
Right.
And Wallace did have the experience of growing up as a young, I would say prodigy, but just a good tennis player as a kid.
He went pretty far, as I gather, within the early seeding. Yeah. No, I was over, visiting my parents this morning, and we're talking, and in the background is enormous TV, and it is Federer playing, and I'm just, my mom can't see; she has macular degeneration, but my father, I'd be talking, but I could just
look over the shoulder.
See him, there goes a shot, and he'd be, back to you, son. Yeah. So there's something. So that's one. Another, we were talking about Henning Mankell. I would love to be a person who had a refined and, addiction. I mean, I have many addictions, and they're not very refined, but like David Gates has one for Rex Stout. Who knows? But
that I did not know about. I knew his. I reread Dickens every year, but he talks about that. But I guess Rex Stout is the.
You should do a whole interview about.
Nero Wolfe. Literally had no clue. That's going to be the next thing I hit him up for.
But that kind of thing. You say, God, I want to be that person. I want to have that person's obsession because they're having so much fun with it. There are a lot of those.
Literally. Do you have any compulsion with reading a book by person X and I've got to read everything they've done, or are you capable of?
Oh, I'm quite capable of not doing that.
Yeah. I mean, my Anthony Pohl thing was when I finally started to dance to the music of time, I thought I'm going to read one per month. I am not going to charge through because I know what I'll go 5 or 6 in, I will lose steam, something will come up and I will never finish this. So it doesn't matter when I finish it each month. The first of the next month is when I can start the next one, and that works. But you sort of have to know your limits, I guess, or the tendencies you have in that respect.
I do tend to, when I really like a writer, I gather. Yeah. I'm not a completionist. I don't have to have everything, and books are scattered haphazardly. Part of the
my organization of my library is pretty scant. Yeah,
but I like to know they're there, and I see. I mean, I hardly ever will sit and back to back read a writer, but once I've accepted them as part of my kinship network and I've gotten enough of their books, then they are around, and then I know the kind of mood that they can put me in, or what they, what charge they have for me, and then I I go back and, a year later I'll pick up another one of somebody I know that I'm going to like. So I have, quite
But generally not genre stuff? Or
No.
Okay.
I don't have a genre, really. Oddly.
No. I mean, I always
yeah.
tell people I'm a goddamn snob, and that's part of it. But, that said, I can recite things from issues of the X-Men that came out when I was 8 years old because they burned themselves into my goddamn brain at that point. So
well, I could probably do that with Hardy Boys too. That's probably the last time I was in the genre. Oh, Ian Fleming, I suppose. I fell hard at age 13 for the whole James Bond series. But I'm trying to think if there's anything that sort of any series that got me after that. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. But just again, we have our
but you know what I'm
snobbishness
finding too, and this becomes this ongoing meditation about how we change. I guess that's a sub theme here, but a prerequisite sensation I need in order to read anything is that it's going to be more interesting to me than whatever it is that I'm vaguely brooding about. So if I'm in a mode where I'm in the vicinity of writing or working on something and I'm at that level of engagement where I'm starting to have thoughts that recur and catch, and that I can actually be sitting there and kind of thinking those thoughts, that to me is 10 times more preferable to reading even, some great master at that moment. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering if I didn't front load too much, because that whole period I talked about reviewing relentlessly for years, it was just, cramming in the words of so many writers with very little break between. And I can have such a grand old time, lining up something there and sort of vaguely thinking about.
Who's your ofer?
I
haven't read anything by this person. I'm embarrassed by it, and I really should have tackled them by now.
Oh, okay. That's always a good dead giveaway. Well,
or at least a major classic. That
a major
omitted.
Classic I have not read. Don Quixote.
This interview's over. I'm out of it.
It's something I've circled around. I certainly through endless reference feel like but I just
the windmills thing is almost at the beginning. It's like Proust with the Madeleine. That's in the first 50 pages. You really have to read the rest of it after that. Yeah. It's not even a signifier that you've started it
I've
anymore.
I've not read Thackeray. I've not read Trollope. So those two big guns from the 19th century. This isn't to suggest by any means that everything else, of course, I've read. No.
But of majors who you're
the people who were
mildly embarrassed about.
Yeah. I'm sure there are just big parts of the American canon. I've not really read Dreiser. Just never had any pull at all toward it. Never read, Frank Norris or. Yeah, I don't know. But they're,
those are significant. That's knowing your lacunae are.
Yeah, but the problem is, and I used to, sometimes they'll play the bookstore game. I'll go into the bookstore and I'll just be there in the A's. And I'll say, read it. But if you hit the pause button and say, "Tell me one thing about,"
God, completely
forget it.
Again, I finished.
No idea what was in there, but I read it.
I know I finished Changing the Subject 10 months ago. It's a bit of an issue to recall. That's why I started reading a couple of reviews of it before leaving the hotel. Just so I was like, oh, yeah, the Virginia Woolf stuff. Duh. Yeah, I forgot. My bookstore game is to go into a bookstore and keep looking until I find a book by somebody I've recorded with, which is always fun.
Well, that shouldn't be too hard.
Generally, no, but airport bookstores, that can be a little tougher.
That's true.
Irvin Welsh tends to be my saving. Pfeiffer, Ross Chast, a few of those, But it's nice when it's somebody obscure, like if I see a Bruce J. Friedman book
at the
on the
airport
shelf.
picking up that last Langdon Warner.
Yeah, you're like, wow, I don't see that enormous James Merrill biography anywhere in this little.
What kind of bookstore are you running here anyway? Yeah,
which was one of my great discoveries of a guest in Langdon and the James Merrill book.
I guess he's doing Bishop now, isn't he? Or he's almost done with
He would
Bishop,
have to be, yeah. I think he talks about it during our conversation. He was also freaked out because I read the Merrill book in 3 weeks, because that's the time I had before we were going to get together. And it took me 13 years, Gil. I'm like, well, I read pretty hard every day.
Yeah.
Also, I told him, I wasn't distracted by having any previous knowledge of James Merrill's work, so that really helped out.
Actually, that's something to be said for that.
I wasn't going to complain about any characterization of the poetry, because, yeah, so I learned a lot in the process, and that also got me in front of Sandy McClatchy later on, which turned out to be a fun conversation too. But yeah, it is kind of weird when you start building all those webs of connections, which I'm sure, again, you have this person led me to bring this person into the program.
Oh, sure, yeah. The webs they're deep and they're endless. I'm kind of curious. So you must have people ask you a lot of, don't you want to do a print selection of,
The funny one was R.O. Bleckman, the great illustrator and animator who I recorded with just about 2 months ago. He saw these postcards and photos of past guests, and his immediate reaction was, you need to get a book of these done with quotes from each of the guests. I thought, yes, I have considered that, but I have a job, and, I'm just some schlub from New Jersey.
I want you to do this, because actually it's one of the weird oddball things that I will buy anything I see that is a book of photos of writers. So I actually have a
We're going to have to get a good one of you in the process of this afternoon.
Work. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, again, Photoshop. I can get rid of that horrible scar and that huge pustule. It'll all be gone.
Excellent.
But yeah, it's part of. And I want to do ebooks of some of these. Get the conversations transcribed.
The quality
et cetera.
of these is very gratifyingly high.
Some writers and artists just either photograph well, or I just know how to catch them at the right moment. Lorenzo Mattotti, the great cartoonist and illustrator, just looks like a Lorenzo Mattotti, and that was one of those. You just sit in that hotel chair. Let me just take this picture, and we're going to be good. And Ross Chast looks like a Ross Chast drawing sometimes, and that's how we end up like this. Do you keep up at all with the used and rare book thing? Because that's something that's been completely transformed by.
It is so transformed. No, and I sort of.
Do you miss? Do you miss the ability, the necessity to hunt something down?
Oh God, yes.
As opposed to just typing something in and getting it.
No, totally.
Okay. Because I still tell people for the 3 people who have any goddamn idea what I'm talking about. Finding Richard Farinha's posthumous collection in the Book Barn up in Vermont back when I was in college, there's no way to hunt for that. That was one of those, I just found this and ran out and never bothered reading it. It's just the fact that I got the thing is good enough. So, but yeah, the thrill of the chase as opposed to the
thrill of the chase, but also, and this in terms of things attributes that change and disappear, and, you can translate it into the realm of GPS or whatever, but I have no call to do this anymore, but I used to pride myself on my a particular quality of visual memory, which is not for anything else. I can't remember, names of my children, but I can remember which side of the page and how far into the book was the quote that used that weird word in
spatial memory of
and I could go up there, and that's what I did incessantly before the internet. There it is, and it was this triumph. Now anybody can do it. It's nothing. You can just put in 2 words, and there's your quote.
And it's something I talked about with Thomas Dolby. I don't know if you know who Thomas Dolby is.
Sound guy?
Yeah, the music guy. She Blinded Me with Science. He's now an instructor or professor down in Johns Hopkins. He was also a tech guy after the pop career ended. I had a friend during college, a friend of mine who was going to Germany for the summer. I sent with $30 and said, come back with Thomas Dolby's second CD because it wasn't available in the U.S. and this is the only way I could get it. And we were talking about how now it's just streaming. You just type it in and it'll just stream. You don't even have to wait for a delivery of something. They'll just start playing on your computer 2 seconds later. And that infinite abundance at the same time becomes I don't say a hindrance, but just a...
Sure. I mean, I think that's another
drag.
word that, can be thrown into this kind of a conversation. It's not just, the fascination with attention and all that, but the word friction, it almost sounds like it should be a category in one of Calvino's, attributes, lightness. Maybe it is. Friction. Everything was marked by its friction factor, and in so many things that's utterly gone, And now that Amazon has purchased Whole Foods, and now that we have drones, there won't even be shopping bags anymore. I mean, what are you going to do? So what's the value of obstacle, difficulty, friction, and encounter? And what do we gain by the bounties of sudden and immediate access versus what do we lose in the psychological disappearance of the chase? Just as to use your terms, because I think that was pretty accurate. That was the thrill of the book business.
A friend of mine who was in that same role said, I came across a first of the recognitions.
That kind of, those moments.
It was $5 in some thrift store, and I was like, this is $1,000 sale I'm about to make. And,
those were the moments. Yeah, God.
Yeah. So when we talk about the internet, getting back to our original subject, that sense of plenitude, barren plenitude, in a way that you have everything, but it doesn't really mean anything.
And it operates on various levels. Let's say you're writing a particular piece. I have this in mind because I'm writing a particular piece. I'm using the capabilities of the internet in many ways. It's a piece on there's a novel coming by this guy Laurent Binet, and it's a
I know the name.
Intellectual mystery. He had a book called HHHH.
Yeah. I thought it was that guy and not the Kindly Ones guy.
Right.
Yeah, because there are two. Never mind.
Anyway, but this one is premised on the death of Roland Barthes. That it was not.
He didn't really die because. Oh, I'm kidding.
It was a murder, and he evolves this whole thing, and sort of the piece that I'm writing on it requires an enormous amount of jumping in and making sure you've got the spelling or the date right, because it's full of. The whole world of the French theorists, they're all in there as characters, totally outlandish and not themselves, but there's Foucault and there's Lacan and there's Kristeva, they all have roles in this mystery, and so you're constantly tagging along between
this attempt
did this really happen, or is it, so you're checking all the time. So it's a wonderful device for doing that.
So it could be the death of the author. That's good. So
exactly.
Feel free to steal that for
I actually that was
I'll write that down now and then zap it over.
When the person wrote to ask if I was interested in doing it, I said exactly that. Who could resist writing a book about the death of the author? Good. Exactly, quote unquote.
Nice.
So, with great minds,
or dilettantism, but whatever. That's
But so we have this tremendous ease to look things up, tremendous ease in getting the words onto the page and not having to retype it 1,000 times. You send it in by tapping send. You get a sort of track changes, edit back 2 days later or whatever. Everything's been you're just checking off things. The thing comes out. You barely know it comes out because it makes the merest little indentation in the enormous flood of all the other things that are coming out. In the old days, you would wait for the
contributor
recoil.
Oh, okay. I thought contributor copies, but
well,
people the
that
feedback.
Too. But something would come out, and there would be a little. You'd either get a recoil thing or you wouldn't. But if it was at all to the point, you would, because people would get their weekly copy of the New Republic or whatever and read it, and if they liked it, they'd let you know somehow, and you felt you existed to be Bishop Barclay, to be is to be seen or whatever. Yeah. You can do stuff now, and well, you must know this too. I mean, you spend all this time doing this, and it's out, and you sort of know it's out, and people vaguely allude to it being out, but you never know how it's out. It's just...
Oh, trust me, there are episodes that have taken off multiple years after they've come out. I don't understand why. I can't find any reference. Yeah. Nobody is. For some reason, Rhonda Gerlich, the woman who did the biography of Coco Chanel, that episode, a year plus after it went out, all of a sudden just starts downloading it down. People just started going, and I still can't figure out where.
If you figure that out, you've got a New Yorker article right there.
Oh, well, trust me, the number one most downloaded episode of this show is Anthea Bell, the translator of German and French. Yeah.
No kidding.
It was Bloom and Clive James, and then for the last 6 months,
gaining fast on
passing Bloom, passing everybody. I'm like, I don't understand why.
There's
that's
probably
the case.
one fat 400-pound guy in a bed
I got to
somewhere.
keep hearing this again and again. Yeah, no, I never understood what it is, but that episode just took off and stays up there. And maybe translators want to hear what she's got to say, but I can't find a link coming back to my site that actually directs them there. So, yeah, it's a weird trip, but that's the internet's full of mystery, I guess.
So it is.
On balance, are you relatively happy with the relationship you have with your writing and with technology at this point? I know happy is a loaded term, but
I could answer that differently at different periods in the last 10 years. I feel right now, just because the last month has been fairly mentally active and words are coming out, I'm feeling in a good place. Ask me back in February, and I might have... had a completely different answer. Whether this is related to my having been sprung from a certain position of responsibility where I was relentlessly worrying about enrollments and students and faculty. And I'm hoping these are linked, because if they are, that's a good omen for the writing life. The technology, it really essentially is. It's the typewriter with... electric possibilities.
You're more reconciled to, I'm going to walk around with an iPhone. I'm going to take goofy pictures every so often.
Yeah, I'm reconciled to that.
It's a good place to be.
Yeah.
Sven Birkerts, thanks so much for coming on the Virtual Memories Show.
A very good pleasure.
And that was Sven Birkerts. His new book is Changing the Subject, Art and Attention in the Internet Age, from Grey Wolf Press. He's also the editor of Agni magazine, that's AGNI. He doesn't have a website, but he is on Twitter at Sven Birkerts and on Instagram at Cyberberk, and that's SvenBirkerts and CYBERBIRK. If you're a reader of his work, it is just hysterical that he is on Twitter and Instagram. But he really does post some lovely images on the latter, and has some neat ruminations and some really funny doodles on Twitter. So check out both of those accounts, and make sure you check out Changing the Subject and Sven's earlier books. Now, once we wrapped up the main session, I asked Sven, so, who are you reading? If you want to hear his answer to that, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. I posted a new one with last quarter's guests recently, and it's a blast. You can get access by supporting the show at patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, patron-only blog where I post about some of the books that I'm reading, the handwritten show notes for every episode, the series of ebooks that I promise to launch someday, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, this episode came at the end of ReaderCon weekend, as I mentioned, so it involved a couple $100 in hotel stay, but my mileage and tolls were covered by work because I went on to a pharmaceutical show right after that on Monday. Still, if you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like web hosting, equipment, travel, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. Make a one-time or recurring donation. A special thanks go out to Kevin Katila, John Wendler, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Stephen Nadler, Wallace Wilde Manozzi, Andrew Mason, Greg Tanner, Garrett Zecker, Craig P. Steffen, Jack Les Camella, and Ron Slate for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories show. We've got the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Nothing's Gonna Bring Me Down by David Bayerwald, used with permission from the artist. David's one of my favorite musicians. His solo work is great, as is the wonderful album he did in the 80s with a band called David and David. And that's it for this week's Virtual Memories show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with science fiction and fantasy editor Gordon Van Gelder. Till next time, you can subscribe to the Virtual Memories show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store or at soundcloud.com/VMSpod. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories show on Twitter at VMSpod, on Instagram at VMSpod, on Facebook at facebook.com/virtualmemoriesshow, and virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com. And if you like this show, please go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories show, and leave a rating and review for this podcast. It'll help us build a bigger audience. Till next time, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you are awesome. Keep it that way.